Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming. I guess you all saw the film just now, right? Well, you can feel free to ask any questions when we get to the Q&A because it's a nice small group. I'm Lisa Eisenpresser. I was the producer on Chasing Childhood, and Margaret obviously directed and executive produced, and I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves, but I wanted to first say that I'm very excited that we get to come back to Brown and show the film and talk about it. Margaret and I both studied here years ago, and we both learned to love filmmaking and storytelling and the secret language of semiotics back in the day. I don't know if they even call it semiotics anymore. So this is kind of a full circle moment for us, and I'm very excited about that. And we just come, we come as parents who have a spirit of curiosity and collaboration, and we're parents who are trying to be better parents and see our kids thrive. So like you, this has been a question that has opened more questions for us. And I look forward to, in that spirit, introducing all of our collaborators here while we look for solutions to some of these issues. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. First, Logan Powell.
Sure. Hi, my name is Logan Powell. I'm the Dean of Admission here at Brown. This is now my 6th year as Dean of Admission at Brown, but I've spent my career in college admissions. Some would describe it as highly selective college admissions. More recently, I've heard us described as the Office of Rejections rather than the Office of Admissions. But my job here is to try to make places and experiences like this as accessible as they can be.
And Yulia?
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Yulia Chentsova Dutton. I am an associate professor of psychology at Georgetown University, and I am interested in understanding psychological consequences of exposure to autonomy in childhood, or lack of exposure of autonomy in childhood.
Good evening. My name is Bryant Ford. I am the director of the Counseling and Psychological Services here at Brown, and spent pretty much 20 years in higher education working in mental health.
Hi, I'm Margaret Munzer Loeb, an alum of Brown University and the director and executive producer of Chasing Childhood, and happy to be here with all of you.
And I forgot my big thanks. I wanted to tell you, of course I buried the lead. I wanted to thank the Brown Arts, we used to call it the Initiative, now it's an institute, for championing our film, and from the moment that we told them that it was complete, it began a planning to bring it back to campus. So I wanted to thank by name Avery Willis-Hoffman, Talia Field, Sofia Lacava Bohanan, Kira Del Sesto, and Sarah Santos for really allowing us to feel like no amount of COVID was ever going to keep us from getting back here. We changed the date several times, but we are here, and they have been incredible to work for, and we have the honor of serving on the council, so thank you very much. All right, we can start. Margaret, I'm going to start with why this film, really. Tell us a little bit about why we made this film.
So Chasing Childhood really happened out of a need to understand why I was raising my children differently than the way I was raised. I was, I think, sitting on a couch with my co-director, Eden Wormfeld, and really just trying to figure out why we weren't letting our kids navigate New York City on their own when we grew up at what was definitively, despite what happened today in New York City, a more dangerous time. And we kind of thought this was maybe a New York issue and started looking at, did a sense of autonomy change only in New York, a place where kids had the freedom to walk around and weren't living in suburban culture? And we started to realize this had happened in more places, and we wanted to know if there were unintended consequences of trying to keep your kids safer. And that actually led us to our first interview, who was Lenore Skenazy, and also to Julie Lifcott-Hames, who was in the film, who kind of gave us a roadmap of, what might be going wrong in the process to give your kids everything, protect them, and overschedule them, and what some of the unintended consequences were.
So Yulia, we brought you here. I'm going to start with you from Georgetown because you are an expert in the research that fed into this film. You look at the consequences of delays in autonomy across all cultures. And I'm hoping that you can explain a little bit to our audience like what that looks like internationally and how it sort of ladders up to the issues of the film.
So in the last few decades, there have been massive changes in how parents offer autonomy to their children. The changes have been most dramatic in the English-speaking, so-called weird cultural contexts, white, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed. So we are talking United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, South Africa. They are also happening in other countries, but not at the same rate. In the United States, in this brief period of time, the age at which children are allowed to go out in the community, walk to school, go to the nearby grocery store, go play in the park, has shifted on the order of about 5 to 6 years. That's a tremendous change. That's 5 or 6 years that children, relative to their parents' generation, do not have of being able to practice what it's like to live in the real world, what it's like to talk to strangers and negotiate things with them, what it's like to have conflicts with peers, what it's like to get lost and then find their way again. All of those experiences have been taken away, and so I became interested in what are the consequences, or what happens when these children are then ready to go into adulthood, but without those years of independence down their belt.
And what are those consequences on mental health? Because one of the things that Margaret was really drawn to was this epidemic in America, certainly, of anxiety and depression from all of the overpressuring, overprotecting, and overparenting. Do you see that across cultures too? And then I'd love to ask you, Bryant, how you see that showing up on campus at Brown.
We don't fully know. It's one of the hypotheses that this has something to do with increases in anxiety and depression. The studies haven't been done to look at it at a large scale. So we don't know whether or not it's contributing. We know it has other negative consequences. So for example, lifelong deficits in the ability to navigate physical environments, getting lost, essentially. Obesity is linked to not having independence. Social relationships are linked to it. Identity as a citizen in one's neighborhood has been impacted. In my studies, I'm interested in how it impacts people's ability to respond to risky situations where there may be some rewards, some threats, and a person has to negotiate. And it appears to be related to lower ability to discriminate between situations that might be quite risky versus those that are not particularly risky or might only rarely be risky. And it appears that our students with limited experience of independence are not really being able to differentiate. To them, all of those experiences are perceived as quite risky.
Yeah. I would say in higher education, it's interesting that both of you mentioned anxiety and depression, because when we start thinking about some of the presentations where students come to our centers, the top 5 are actually, the top 2 are usually anxiety and depression. And in fact, the American College Health Association, which is an organization that addresses college health with professionals, they often do a survey every other year. And what they do is they survey students to sort of assess what do they perceive to be the impediments to academic success. And invariably, every other year, the top 3 are often stress, anxiety, and depression. So this is really showing up in the classroom, but it's also showing up on our college campuses. And the way in which I think we're being impacted by it is more and more students are asking for services. So we can't keep up with the demand in which students are asking. Invariably, also, when students do come, they will often want an individual appointment. But one of the things that we know from research is that being in a group setting sometimes can normalize and destigmatize some of the things that they're dealing with, but it's really hard trying to get students to recognize that this might be the best treatment modality to cure the anxiety or the depression they're experiencing.
And that's nothing that you can see on your end, Logan, when you have students applying. There's no way to really...
Well, no, it's really hard for us to see, because when students apply to a highly selective institution, you only see the good things. You only see what they want you to see. You don't ever get to see the whole picture. And you also don't know how college is going to change them. For many of these students, it's their first time living away from home. It's that first moment of being independent. It's the first moment where their parents aren't there for them all the time, and they have to negotiate on their own, in most cases, how to get through their days. And colleges like this offer incredible support services, and yet for some of our students, having to negotiate roommate challenges and conflicts will be the first time in their lives they've had to do that. Having unstructured time. This is like one of the themes in the movie is like, in that one section where I think it was the young woman who says something like, actually, I don't have anything scheduled for Thursday. And it was like this revelation that, there was an afternoon of one day that wasn't scheduled. Well, you get to college and no one's checking in on you, after or outside of class. And so having to figure out how to structure your unstructured time is happening for the first time as well. So there are a lot of firsts when students get to college that you can't anticipate. And so you look for proxies that help you determine whether or not students have, along the way, developed those mechanisms that are the tools that you think they need for the challenges that they haven't yet faced, but we know that they can figure out.
Right. So Margaret, I mean, you talk about how it's almost too late by that point, like you want to hit the milestones much earlier. You want to talk a little bit about, like, sort of the Lenore Skenazy of it all?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm the sort of layman filmmaker with a social work degree. Yeah, I think that, like, one of the things that we were interested in the film is, what could be done, what could we be doing differently? And what are some things that we might have even had before, not that we're going to completely roll back the clocks, that we didn't even realize were things that were helpful, that were just sort of happening organically. And one of them was free play. So Peter Gray, who's in the film, is a biological psychologist, and really talks about play as not just something that you do because it is fun, which it is, but because we need to be doing it, and that there are things that make up play, like that it has to be multi-aged, that you're learning to deal with conflict, and the way that I think about it, and again, I'm not the psychologist, but like, these are like, I think of it as like, these are the muscles you need to build throughout your life. You need to experience conflict with someone who may have a little more power than you, meaning the older kid in the neighborhood, potentially, or a group of them. You need to maybe have some people reject your idea that you wanted, the way you wanted to build the fort, so that you could come up with a better idea, right? So you could actually come up and say, what's going to make them like my idea? So all of those things that maybe we did, and not that our kids do none of, but those are like real building blocks for navigating the world around you, for being creative, for problem solving. And when you take that away, if you have very little of that, or the only versions of that are very curated and structured, you're going to have to probably look for some interventions later to make up for the fact that you didn't have them. And so that's sort of my hope, is like, maybe some of the work would be a little bit easier if kids, if young adults had some of those kind of the muscle to know how to navigate some of those smaller things. Maybe they could handle the bigger stuff that happens when you're on a college campus. If you're navigating living in a room for someone for the first time when you're a freshman in college, well, that's probably not such a good idea.
Right. Right. I mean, I'm wondering, Yulia, if you're seeing the consequences of the sort of what we call the end of childhood globally. We came across data that by 2003, all of Julie Lythcott-Haim's kind of what she pointed out, all of the trends that were happening steadily had culminated in this inflection point where kids were spending decidedly all of their time inside. Their childhood had moved from outdoor unsupervised play little by little by little to indoor behind closed walls. So what is the impact of that on kids everywhere, and especially, like, are there any bright spots globally?
There are a number of places where, although these changes are taking place, they are not taking place at the same speed. And so you have countries where they manage to retain the norms of allowing children early independence. Japan is one such place. Germany, or also just Northern Europe, Sweden, Finland. Israel is a place like that. A number of African countries, Ghana, for example, is a place like that. Eastern Europe offers lots of pockets like that, where you still see children navigating the environment on their own and still collecting those experiences. And we're starting to identify data that suggests that these experiences are then very useful for their transition to childhood, that people use them to really use the tools that they have developed in their childhood when encountering mild stressors in their environment, unsupervised, left to their own devices or with peers, and they use those tools to then solve bigger problems that they might encounter when they're young adults leaving their home. And so it's important to allow children to have it. And you mentioned free play. Among my students, I ask the question, at what age did you start playing in the neighborhood without adult supervision? And a really sizable number of my students at Georgetown say, look, by the time my parents were ready to allow me to play in the neighborhood, I was no longer interested in playing in the neighborhood. I was 14 years old or something like that. Who plays in it? Like that time period where the child wants to run around the neighborhood chasing others and doing hide and seek and riding their bike is gone. It's not coming back. And we know that adversity has an interesting relationship to wellness. You need a little bit. High levels of adversity are bad for mental health. But very, very low levels of adversity are also bad. You need some. Just like for your immunity, you need some exposure to dirt and germs in order to be healthy. You don't want sanitized environment. It's not protective. Neither do you want really anti-sanitary environment. You want something in between.
Absolutely. Do you want to talk about Jonathan Haidt here? Because
Yeah, I
he's
was actually going
anti-fragile.
to almost jump in and just say one of the, we got to interview many people for the film who turned out to not be in the film because of the way we decided to structure it, including Logan, but we had also interviewed Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's not his theory, the anti-fragility theory but he talks about, that kids should be anti-fragile, that you should be having to have a certain amount of stress in your life, like more analogous to bones. So, if you never walked, if you never ran, if you never fell down, your bones would actually weaken over time, and that your childhood is supposed to be filled with a certain amount of stress so that you get stronger. And that there are things that we're doing or holding up as like the great ways to rear children that are doing the opposite. I think what's hard is, in some ways, we're saying kids are under so much stress, but maybe not the right kinds.
Yeah, I mean, it's related to what Angela Duckworth, you've mentioned this before, in her book Grit, talks about that one of the most important predictors of success is having like a passion and persistence and follow through in pursuing that. But how can parents really balance wanting gritty kids with wanting kids who are, not being pushed so hard and forced through the eye of the needle in competition? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
If I can respond, I think some of what I observe, I don't have the research background that Yulia does, but I see many examples of this, and I have a multitude of anecdotes, and I will be the first to acknowledge that the plural of anecdote is not fact. But you do see patterns, and I think one of the struggles I see is in parents trying to figure out what's the right level of challenge, what's the right level of support, and I think in many cases, there's just my sense, the intentions are always good. The intentions are always meaningful, and these are really caring parents, but they care so much. Some might say they care too much about keeping their kids in sort of a protective bubble and not letting them fall down and scrape their knees or learning on their own. The parents feel this need, and maybe it's because they perceive some things to be more anxiety filled or more complicated or more high stakes than ever before, and as a result of that, the parents feel that they need to coddle and protect and guide to the degree that, in fact, the child, the student in many cases, has not learned how to read the map themselves. They're told which direction to turn and when to turn, and they never have to navigate life on their own. Right. And that gets difficult much later in life, as we've heard.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this film originated with Julie Lythcott-Hames's book, How to Raise an Adult, and her observation as a dean at Stanford was there were more parents on campus than there were kids at drop-off. And I'm wondering if you've seen the same. I know you just left Dartmouth, now you're at Brown. Like, are they coming and they're falling apart without their parents, or are they getting therapy about their parents?
I would say both, right? I mean, and some of them are coming into the building on the phone with their parents, right? Like, learning how to schedule an appointment, right? Because they've never had to be able to do that before. So some of these basic life skills, their lives have been organized in such a way where they haven't been able to do some of that. So they get there and sometimes they end up falling apart. I really like this conversation about the stress level, because it makes me think of the stress curve and just how you're right. Like, I think I used to teach a workshop for first year students, and I was always astonished that all of them, when you say stress, it always was negative, but not realizing stress is positive and negative. But they never think about that positive stress that allowed them to be able to get into some of these institutions. For example, you need a little bit of stress if you're an athlete to be able to perform, or a musician to be able to perform, or as I tell them, when you're sitting for college boards, if you're there catatonic, you're really not going to be able to do well. You need a little bit of that stress to sort of be able to perform. And so some of this is providing with that language, because I think everything has been sort of communicated to them in such a black and white kind of way that they don't sort of look at the nuance. And I think that's some of that skill building, the resilience that we're talking about, is really providing them with those skills so they can learn how to navigate college.
And probably just having experience, right? I mean, so much of this is about putting you into what Margaret was saying earlier is just exposure therapy, like that you have to be exposed to these things in order to get better. Margaret, can you talk about like how important it is really to experience setbacks and failure?
I mean, yes, I think, we were looking through these clips. Angela Duckworth wanted to teach a class on failure. She thinks kids have gotten so bad at experiencing failure, and parents tolerating. First of all, it's not failure. Like, it's actually just like doing a little less well or not winning and experiencing those things as failure, as opposed to I didn't do as well as I thought I would. I think that that's one of the interesting things, and I think it's related to the lack of nuance in black and white thinking, which is like if it's not perfect, it's a fail. The character Savannah in the film, that's a lot of what she experienced, like that razor's edge. We heard it a lot. We talked to a lot of kids crying in the closet if they got an A-, collapsing on the floor that the world was going to come to an end. How were they going to go home? And parents seeing their, in a lot of public school systems, seeing their grades before their kids even come home. So the whole role of, you never even have a moment to absorb your own setback or whatever, because it's all happening in real time. And therefore, you're not even going to absorb, you're not even going to go through the coping skills that you might go through, because you're going to automatically, there's parents and other people involved. I think what's interesting, what I was saying to you earlier in terms of exposure therapy, is people are signing up in droves for cognitive behavioral therapy because it is the modality other than medication and meditation that's seen to actually be able to do anything for anxiety. And when so much of cognitive behavioral therapy are things that you should be learning in real life. Like, we can all be doing graded desensitization and versions of exposure therapy, and we can work on, those moments of teaching self-talk to your child or having them learn that are things that you should be learning kind of throughout your life. So I actually think, I think everyone can benefit from CBT, but I do also feel like there's reasons why people are surgically needing to go in and make up for things that they didn't have kind of organically throughout their life, that we're hoping that we can start a conversation, or what we've been trying to do is start a conversation that will influence culture enough to make those things more integrated into the way kids are being raised, to make it so there are, the crises that will always come up are maybe smaller bumps in the road instead of less catastrophic as they've seemed to be for some people.
Yeah. May I?
Yeah.
One of the things I appreciate also hearing is there is a tendency sometimes to over-identify with an act or behavior. So it's interesting because people say, I'm a failure as opposed to I failed at something.
Right.
And I think a lot of the language that we're trying to do, is, especially in treatment, is how do we sort of detach the person from the behavior, because you're not the behavior. But when you learn that, you are a smart student or you're a straight A student, and you keep hearing that over and over again, it's kind of hard to sort of peel away from that. And so I just like to sort of remind that, because I think sometimes we get too carried away when identifying people with their actions.
Yes, I mean, and that everything is meant to be measured. We live a life where we're constantly being measured, and we're always aiming for something, which Genevieve talks about in the film.
She also says, I'm just going to interrupt,
Yeah,
which
no, please.
I say this a lot as a parent. She said at one time, like, this line about, we always tell our kids to do their best, and we don't stop and think what that must feel like.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you do your best at everything all day long? Do you do your best when you put your clothes on and when you take the, like at all the tasks of your day? That's really tiring. We pick and choose some things to do our best at and other things to do fine. And I
or
thought
just
that
to live in the mundane. Like, why should we always be striving, right?
Anyway, I thought that was really helpful. So as a parent, we have these lines in schools too. Do your best, do your best, do your best. And never stop and say, like, to have, even just have that conversation. What does that mean?
Right. Well, I think that's a great segue to talk about one of the most important themes, which is, we talked a little bit about what failure looks like, but what is success? How do we define that? Why is it so important for our kids to be successful? I think that parents see it as tied to well-being even, and that's why we talk about the unintended consequences of trying to make your kids successful and achieving. But what is our definition of success? I'm going to go to you first. And how do we measure it, potentially broaden it, and maybe reframe it entirely?
Right. Well, I think there are the familial expectations for what success is. I think there are the friend or peer group expectations. I think there are the public expectations. And I think finally there is the self-expectation of what success is. Look, I took many classes where passing the class was a great success. And then others where success needed to be an A. So it was all relative. And I think, at least from where I sit, that sense of relativity has really diminished over time. Success now has to be being perfect at everything at all times. I mean, to your point, Margaret. And it's titles, it's achievements, it's winning at everything. There's no room for second place. I think there is the sense that it's a winner-take-all sort of society. And I think that's where things become really incredibly unhealthy, is understanding that it should be the individual definition of success. And I know from where I sit, being the dean of a highly selective institution, that this sounds really disingenuous to some people when I say, look, your admission to this institution should not define you, and yet in the moment it does. And try to get them to step back and stop seeing everything. Because at the time that they apply to this university or others, in many cases, I see students and families where everything has been a means to an end. You participated in the activity, you took the class, you went on the trip in order to achieve some greater goal. It wasn't because you enjoy this topic or because you enjoy the activity. The activity is intended to signal something to someone who's going to evaluate you. And so I try to tell students very early on, a couple things, if I may, really quickly.
Yes,
do the things that you really like to do, but also, maybe for years, by the way, I would say, you need to find your passion. Do the thing you're passionate about. Identify your passion. And then I, sort of in the theme of this conversation, thought back about my younger days when I was in high school, and I thought, what were my passions. I don't remember what I didn't have a passion. I liked running, I liked biology, but I don't know that I had, like, if someone asked me what's my passion, I don't know. And so I got away from saying that because I think even that put pressure on students to identify a passion that they could package to present at some later date.
It's all to you, yes.
To me, yes. And so I try to get students to step back from that and just say, kind of like, let that go. Do the things that you like to do and just trust that things will work out and that this one decision is not going to define the rest of your life.
I mean, I wonder if you even see a bunch of seniors across the country happy. Like, do you see anyone who's just like, yeah, I'm really just loving high school?
Yeah, yes, I have. So I don't know if that was a rhetorical question, but
I know it's somewhat rhetorical, but I'd love to be wrong.
I met a student from Los Angeles, as a matter of fact, and she was the happiest young woman I think I've met in quite a long time. And I asked her essentially like why she was so filled with joy, or words to that effect essentially. And her answer was because she was not on social media. And it was fascinating. She said, I don't feel any pressure to like do the thing, to post on the thing.
Right.
There was no pressure to live her life for public consumption. She did the things she wanted to do, and she was able to step back. But that took enormous courage because everyone in her peer group was on social media platforms and living their lives through social media platforms. And it was really an act of bravery for her to step back from it. But in the end, it made her one of the happiest people I've ever met.
You remove compare and despair.
Yes.
Yulia, how do you see this turning up, cross-culturally, and is success in any way related to income inequality and the pressure on parents to make their kids succeed so that they can actually change stations in life?
So the definitions depend so much on the individual and their family, of course, but also differ tremendously across cultures. And they line up with how the desired selves differ across cultures. We are in a very individualistic cultural context. The United States is an outlier among other countries on being individualistic, meaning that individual attributes are particularly important rather than social ties, rather than community relations. And so success is often defined in terms of the individual values, goals, passions. Have you been able to find them, searching for them, finding them, following them? And so when you look at how students define success or how they formulate kind of what their ideal future might look like, it often looks like that. When you look in more collectivistic cultures, which is the norm around the world, most countries in the world are much more collectivistic than we are. Their success is in terms of how my community is doing. Yes. Have I contributed to my community? Has my community supported me? Do I fit in? Do I belong? Success is defined in terms of, is my family successful? Have I helped family members? What about my friends? What about my larger community? And that definition of success, it's more stable. Because even if you are experiencing a setback, somebody in your community isn't. And you can bask in their glory. You can think like, my cousin just maybe I didn't get into the college I wanted to get into. My cousin did, right? My best friend did. And you really can think about success as a characteristic of your group. Sort of so you ask, Korean parents, what's successful life? And they would say, my career, my own goals, but my kids doing well. The nephews and nieces doing well. Mm-hmm. And so with that definition of success, you can almost always find things to rejoice in. Whereas if it's just up to you, that's an incredibly unstable definition of success, because if you are failing, the small failure feels like much larger thing because it reflects on your ability to be successful. I think.
So it seems like it's much more about your community thriving, however you define community, right?
Yeah, and students, of course, come to American universities with different models. And in particular in the United States, lower socioeconomic status communities are much more collectivistic than higher. And so those students come in and are looking for the version of success that college can help them with, and they are looking for, what can I bring back to my community? How can I benefit? How can I connect? And so for them, it's less about finding my own personal passion and more about kind of building those connections.
And if I may, I really appreciate that, because that's one of the challenges sometimes that happens in therapy, because they're coming in as a person looking to gain something, whether it's insight or behavioral change. But the reality is that many of them, when they make decisions, it's not just about them, it's about how does this impact my entire family, right? And so trying to shift that sort of individual perspective to a collective is so that you don't lose the client and have them still be engaged in the process. That's a really good point.
Do you want to connect that to, I'm thinking about Lenore and how she understands that in order to make change, it can't just be one parent saying, I'm going to let my kid go out and, and be autonomous and take the subway by himself. It's about a community effort. And tell everyone about Let's Grow.
I guess that sort of relates.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, you have to shift, all of the things that we're talking about, even if we're a more individualistic society, we can't make a change unless there's a collective shift. And maybe we need to be more collective, more care for one another, and more of a sense that, even the example I was giving these guys earlier of the neighborhood where there's a collective responsibility for eyes on the street or for other people's children, or you can knock on any door. One of the things we heard, even in affluent suburban or blue-collar neighborhoods like Patchogue, was a lot of sense that you couldn't knock on anyone's door anymore. The neighbors didn't know each other anymore. So there was this whole other piece of how communities have changed in all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. And I'm not saying that's in every neighborhood, but just the sense that so when you're trying to then make a shift and have, play out in the street or kids walking to school, well, that's even harder if you don't know who your neighbors are. That's why this is, I think this stuff gets really complicated, because it's always a which comes first. What do you do first? And that's sort of in these areas that have been trying to make change, how they end up doing something that sounds sort of artificial, like we're going to have a play street, or we're going to have extra recess, or they have to kind of manufacture some things that used to be automatic because they don't have other mechanisms in place, like just know all the neighbors on your street.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder when we talk about this, where change is going to come from, because there are different constituency groups. There's the higher ed group, there's secondary schools, there's parents. And everyone is really reluctant to be the one to say, we're going to change the way we look at success. We're going to take the pressure off. We're going to de-escalate the college arms race, right? I mean, we hear so much about the college arms race. Where do you think this is going to begin, the change?
Right. It's an excellent question. So someone has to disarm first, yes. Right? And to continue the
yes,
analogy.
Yes, sorry. War.
No, someone has to disarm first, but I think there's this question of who's going to blink and who is best equipped to begin that process. And I think you see halting movements at every level. The problem is when they're not synchronized, or when you don't have a critical mass who adopts that change. And there have been, and I could run down a list of ideas, interventions, policy announcements that have been made that have attempted to de-escalate, as it were. The problem is if you don't have enough adopters, or if you don't have the right adopters, then it doesn't get adopted. And so how does that change begin? And does it begin with higher ed? Does it begin at the elementary level? Does it begin with parents? Does it begin with students? It's a really good question. I don't know where this is going to go, because I think everyone, at least as of now, is sort of unwilling to lower their shields, as it were. There is incredible pressure. Being completely transparent, there's incredible pressure, across the board. Not so much from me. I'm not speaking in my role as Dean of Admission at Brown, but in this landscape, there's pressure. There's pressure on the colleges to have more applications and to be able to, fill their beds, to have low admit rates, high SAT scores. There's pressure on high schools to have their students admitted to the right colleges. There's pressure on elementary schools to have their students get into the right high schools. There's pressure on parents. It's a reinforcing loop of anxiety that will be really, really tough to break. So all of that is to say, I don't know where this will begin. I think there will be a societal moment. I think there will, and I think COVID could be part of that lever that moves this, where people start questioning the value of certain things. People question the value of standardized testing, as an example.
Right.
People begin questioning the value of spending 40 hours a week in an office, in a cubicle.
That's right.
There are real questions being
Flying on an airplane for a lunch.
Exactly. I think it may take an external force that we can't predict right now, and that may be out of our control, to completely shift the way we see this current landscape.
But COVID has certainly been an accelerant. I'm thinking about Finland and Norway, Yulia, and how we do know, maybe it's not happening here, but there we know that kids go to school like when they're 7. There's very little to no homework or testing, and they have some of the highest PISA scores out there. So are you seeing better practices elsewhere that might lead the way for our shift?
So you do see these Northern European, Central European countries develop a lot of practices for independence that we can look at and potentially start adopting. So for example, a very common strategy that they might use are outdoor portions of education that are happening outdoor. Children are exposed to forests with adult supervision, but limited supervision. So the kids are going out and playing, the adult is there with an assumption that children are competent and can play in the forest on their own, the way I played in the forest throughout my childhood. So they are doing things like that. They are creating playgrounds with some, from an American standpoint, dangerously, genuinely risky play structures where kids could play. This is a little difficult with legislation here, but they are using these approaches to introduce children to risks. I agree that COVID, despite all the really tremendous negative impacts on our lives, in this arena has played in very different ways in different communities. So I was very interested in what happens to children's independence once COVID hits. And in some communities, especially where parents were able to move to remote work, what happened is that the parents were at home, kids were at home, and the kids had even less independence than before. They were spending even more time with their parents. But there are other communities where parents felt that the community was safer and felt like they need, even if remote work is happening, they want children out of the house while they're working. Or in some communities where parents were not at home. So some pockets of American children got far more independence than they previously have. And in my own neighborhood in Maryland, it was very clear where these neighborhoods were. I would walk through the neighborhoods, and in some neighborhoods you could see no children around at all. So these are the places where autonomy got rolled even further back than it has been. But there are other neighborhoods where I'm seeing kids are playing basketball on the street. There are signs, kids that play, please don't drive here. Parents put them for COVID. The kids are running around chasing each other. And so it's clear here's a neighborhood where kids got more independence. So I'm hoping that these kind of natural laboratories would give us some information of how these kids are faring, what happened to their education, what happened to their emotional functioning, are they benefiting or are they not benefiting from that exposure?
And that also happened in, I know some neighborhoods in New York that happened because everything else was canceled. So, our friend's street in Harlem, there was a huge street that, a block that was like all play all the time, but like those kids are often on teams and other things, and that wasn't happening, so they made this play street. And in Eden, my co-director's, her neighborhood, they were also in Brooklyn. Like she said, the streets used to be quiet, but in COVID, everybody was playing in the streets because it became that outdoors was safer, and that was, they would let them out and play, and then suddenly the kids weren't programmed. But, you know, how much, so they learned some like autonomy then, but some of them that dried up. I wanted to just say, and I, like, this is your role, Lisa, but I also just, like, one of the levers that is creating all of this stress that I want to acknowledge is the socioeconomic uncertainty that families are concerned about. And, you know, we put a little of that in the film, this idea that, like, there was a time in which you just needed to graduate high school, and then there's a time, like, you need to get a college education, and now it's that you need to go to the right school. And now, even if you go to the right school, our graduates from Brown are wondering how they're going to pay for their apartment.
Right.
So, you know, and I just sort of think that that's an interesting, I don't want to say that that's not a real concern. So when parents are calling you, Logan, and they're worried, they're thinking their kid's whole future, which may be even how they're actually going to support themselves, or there's an economic anxiety that, you know, we heard over and over again as well, that I don't want to say
Right.
isn't there. And I guess I would say that some of the information that is useful is, you know, is as much as we love Brown or an Ivy League school, is that really what's going to have an enormous impact on your economic future? And if you could make the case that being able to live in the world and on your own is of equal value in being able to be successful, that might be something that people can wake up and hear a little bit.
Well,
Because
with increasing income inequality, and I want to throw this to you, of course, but there is an increasing intensity about getting into brand name colleges. And I know that I think it's Norway or Finland, some of your research has shown that where schools are much more commensurate with one another and there isn't as much difference and there's less income inequality, all of this sort of
there's a really key piece that Frank Bruni says in Where You Go Is Not Who You Will
Yep.
Be on college admissions. He says, it doesn't matter where you go to school so much unless you're a kid of color. And then it actually matters more. So families are not wrong from all kinds of, you know, from different backgrounds, that it does matter. So it's you know, we're
in the lower 20% on the income scale where it actually does change your station to go to those schools. But with the majority of people vying to go to those schools, it changes not at all, and you can go to one of, you know, 50 schools and you'd have the same outcome. So I ask you if what we're talking about you're seeing on the global stage, and then Bryant, if you see differences in these kids that, you know, from different cultures in terms of their mental health and their success in school.
So I would say yes, but it's also tied again to, for many of these students, in particular if they're coming from working class backgrounds, you know, the student gets into one of these types of elite schools, and it's like the family, we've made it, right? And so so what it means is, what does this mean in terms of my child being able to graduate and get a job? Because it's not just taking care of themselves, it's also taking care of the family. And so there's a lot of pressure. I remember working with a lot of students, undergraduates, who were looking for the right job when they graduated. They can't come to a school like Brown or to Dartmouth and major in something that's not going to translate into a really good high-paying job. And you would be amazed at, I mean, so I don't want to put Dartmouth on the map in this way, but one of the things that would happen at Dartmouth is that seniors would have this rush for corporate recruiting. And you would see this mad dash for everybody, making sure that they got all of their materials in at this time. And the ones who couldn't do that, we would sort of see them in the counseling center because they would fall apart. They'd be dysregulated, emotionally dysregulated. But then they would get these interviews, and you know, there's these first and second and third rounds, And if they didn't get past that, we'd see them again in the counseling center because they would be really upset about this. So there is a lot of pressure that I think a lot of these kids, whether it's on their own or it's coming from others outside of themselves, to really be able to sort of secure something that's going to suggest to them that not only did they get into this place, but they were able to make it work for them.
I just got the signal that it might be time to turn this over to audience questions. So now is your time.
I can jump in.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for being here, and we're really grateful that we are filming this in this COVID age. The accessibility to this incredible conversation and to your film is really important. So we're very hoping here at the BAI that more people will see this. And I'm curious, for me, the power of film is so prevalent tonight, the way that you structured your story and the way that you thought through the relationship with these incredible folks. So I'm kind of curious a little bit for you two on the end there. What was another storyline that you could have pursued? You kind of hinted at that a little bit. This film has brought up so many questions and so many different lines. Was there another storyline that you could have pursued?
Yeah.
Margaret.
Yes. So in addition to having many experts that we chose to not put in the film because we wanted to have more of, actual story to follow, there was a story in Patchogue, Long Island of a father and son. The father was a police officer in Patchogue, a white police officer, and his son was a very high-performing student who had a job working at like a sandwich shop, and he was vying to be first in his class. And they were a great family. We followed them for a long time, and his whole life was around trying to be number one in his class in Patchogue. He ended up getting into, I believe, Cornell and writing a letter about how he felt like, he had really mixed feelings about what his childhood was like, kind of doing everything he could to go to an elite university. And I think the other thing about it was his dad was a sincere, great guy, but his dad there was so little separation between the two of them. Like, the dad was applying to college, the dad scores, everything was we did the Little League, we did the this, we did the whatever, and it was kind of amazing to have it be a father who was that enmeshed in his kid's life. So we made choices, but that was one that we, spent a lot of time with and was a great story.
Will I ask anything?
Well, now that I know that Chasing Child, thank you. It was
Thank
a
you.
wonderful film, and I really enjoyed it. I'm sort of curious about the next phase, because Chasing Childhood came out of pre-COVID, and I think things have changed a lot with kids with COVID. Just more screens, more, in my own reflection, it seems like there's more sort of inward time on screens. So I just was curious what you all thought about that, and if there is.
I would just answer briefly, and these guys can talk about what has changed, but I would say that we made a pilot for a Chasing Childhood podcast so that we can be more nimble to follow more stories in more parts of the country with different kinds of kids and families, and we are working on that. And you can go to chasingchildhooddoc.com for both more information on that and for some of the interviews and clips that we didn't get to put in the film on all kinds of topics like failure and sleep and sports specialization and
College board.
yeah, College Board. I mean, there's a lot of
it's an archive of expert videos that is being built there that
yeah.
will be very useful to people. Do you guys want to talk about
How COVID
the
has
COVID silver
impacted
linings maybe?
changes.
Yeah, I would say, so in terms of like learning, one of the things that was really interesting for me to hear from some of my colleagues who work in accessibility services, that COVID really helped some of the students learn better when they were not being in the classroom. I also heard some of my colleagues talk about how many students prefer to not be in the classroom because they experience less microaggressions while learning. So there have been some benefits. I also think that as much as that has been beneficial for some students, I have also heard from some students that learning, being online all day, every day has been exhausting. It has sort of increased their levels of anxiety. Some students also feel like they have increased levels of depression, that they can't focus and or concentrate. And I even had some students who chose to take a leave of absence from school because one of the things I really appreciate about some of the students, I don't mean I didn't appreciate others, but some of the things that some of these students said was, let's be real, COVID is not normal. And so the idea that we're trying to make this a normal learning experience, so some of them elected to be able to sort of maybe take a step away and really prioritize their health over trying to get their degree in 4 years or so. And so they came back when, we're still in a pandemic, but I think they recognized the challenges of back then without having a vaccine and things of that nature were less of a concern than now. And so they've come back into the classroom, but just recognizing that we're not in a normal space and they weren't going to try to pretend that it is normal, which I love that level of reality testing. And so to be able to address and prioritize their health over everything, I think was phenomenal.
I just wanted to share one thing that I've heard a few times. Again, this is very anecdotal, which is there were kids, particularly if you had a child who was in middle school and then was suddenly a 10th grader and they missed a lot of in-person school. And I also heard this from like the head of Putney Student Travel, so they get kids from all over, that they saw kids who look like 10th graders, 10th grade boys, but in every way, socially and emotionally, they were 8th graders. I've heard this over and over again, and I have kids this age. And schools were not entirely prepared for that. And so I don't know what that means in terms of how things have just changed going forward, but we now have this generation of kids, and depending on where you were transitioning in your psychological and social emotional milestones and even academic, maybe some of those were a bigger deal. But, playing catch up for most kids is really hard. And the expectation that they should suddenly be able to play catch up both in that area of their life as well as academically has also been challenging. And especially in places, my kids got to go to school to some degree, but there are kids that missed a full year and a half. I mean, that's a really long time to be integrated with other kids in a learning environment. And I was telling these guys, there are kids I know that just absolutely crashed, and the schools and the programs that are there to kind of catch a lot of those kids are full. So they've just never seen such a crisis.
Yeah, and we also saw the remote learning was a lot of the other insecurities that came about, whether it was housing insecurity or food insecurity or internet insecurity. This came up in college a lot, so a lot of students were petitioning to be on campus because being at home, they had insecure internet. So if you're trying to learn, especially if you're trying to learn across time zones, it was just so particularly challenging. And so we really had to sort of think about how do we create some infrastructure on campus to be able to accommodate some of these students, even though we were trying to de-densify campus to allow students to be there and keep it safe. So there was just a lot of, I think whenever a decision was made, we had to be careful about the disparate impact it had on the different offices, but also on students in their learning.
Can I add one thing on this? I think, so I love this question. This is a great question, and I think it will take years to determine the impacts, both health impacts, but psychological impacts as well. The other thing that happened during COVID was centered here in the United States, but became a global sort of cause, and that was the cause for social rights, social justice. We saw, coincident with COVID, a massive social rights movement in this country, and because students were not, there were many factors behind this. Students not being in school and not having the traditional school-sponsored activities actually gave them time and space to devote to these things that they wouldn't have had time to devote to earlier. And so we saw, and I talked to any number of students, hundreds of students over the past 2 years, whose eyes were opened to these issues of insecurity and differential justice that I don't think anyone had seen before. So as COVID was a global phenomenon, I don't mean that in a positive way, like an event, so too were some of these social justice movements. And so I think our students became engaged in ways that they didn't before, and had to think about what it meant to have, you know, a family of 5 in a 2-bedroom apartment with unstable internet. We heard stories about, you know, high school age students literally sitting in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant to borrow their Wi-Fi so that they could download a class assignment. And so those kinds of injustices were visible to, I think, to the country and to the world in a way that they weren't before. And I hope that the good things that have come from that identification, that realization, stay with us, and that those students continue to push for the kinds of positive changes that will try to bridge those gaps.
Bella, welcome.
Thank you guys for coming.
Bella worked on the film, everyone. From Brown, and then went to Brown, and now she's here.
And so they're there. Thank you. But I guess I was wondering, something that was really emphasized throughout my college process was that you had to be good at everything. You had to have all A's, you had to have some sort of, a bunch of extracurriculars under your belt, president of this club, in that club, X, Y, Z. And my favorite thing about being at Brown is how you don't have to have 1,000 different passions. You can just really focus and hone in on the one thing that you're really inspired by. And so I guess I was wondering if you guys thought there was ever going to be this sort of shift in the narrative that high schoolers are hearing about focusing on a passion and not being perfect at everything that you're doing, in order to just really sort of dive deep at what you're good at and not feel bad that you got to be in math because you're a humanities person and not a STEM person.
I'm glad you asked that question, because Logan's going to answer that question, and you saved him from my question, which was going to be one of the things we added to our website, where everyone should go, Chasing Childhood, that David Coleman, who's the head of the College Board, he called the common app request for 12 extracurriculars a recipe for terror. And so when Bella says that now that she's at Brown, that she can sort of dispense with 11 of them, maybe. I want Logan to answer your question, but also through the lens of this one, where the research from the college that the College Board has is that outside of grades and test scores, that there's only one thing really that can predict success that you can be doing, and that's something to which you're passionately devoted over time. So
Right.
there you go, Bella and David Coleman. You have to answer to.
I'll answer this briefly, but we could do another movie on this, I'm sure. It's a great question, Bella, and congratulations and welcome. What year are you, by the way?
I'm junior.
You're junior, okay, so I guess congratulations is a little outdated now.
It's
but
okay, it's been COVID.
It has been COVID, so.
You're a freshman again.
Exactly. So yeah, I think you've hit on something that takes courage on the part of institutions to do, which is to seek out those students who don't just have perfect credentials. And you know, there are rewards in the society in which we live for having those profiles that are like as pristine as they can possibly be. But what you lose out on in many cases by doing that is, you know, sort of that texture. You know, the student who got the B but is an incredible artist or humanist. schools like Brown, and I would argue every institution, are made better by having students who are not attempting to be perfect at everything. Those students who say, that's not really my thing. I'll continue to take it because I find it interesting, but I'm okay getting a B in it. And the school, the college, has to be able to say, we're okay with that too. Because we want students who, what I would say is, I think high school students get caught up in this notion that they have to be perfectly well-rounded. They have to do everything to the best of their ability. They have to do everything perfectly, and it's just not true. I mean, we love really sort of pointy, angular students who really follow that thing that they really want to do. Some people call it a passion. I have sort of stepped back from calling it a passion, but that devotion to a thing that they're really interested in, that maybe they'll continue in college and maybe they won't. But I think it's the sense, as I think about it, it's a sense of being connected to something. It's a connection to people. It's a connection to purpose. It's a connection to making a positive change, perhaps. I think that's the thing that really stands out to us, and that I hope colleges and universities reward more than the joiners, and we know who they are. Like we're pretty good now at identifying the joiners versus those who are devoted to, a thing or two or three. And I think it's really important. I think that's going back to your question about, sort of disarmament. It's being willing to say it's okay to not do everything.
Right.
In fact, it's healthy to not do everything.
Right.
We don't want you to do everything, but it's also hard. And I'll say this because it's not always what we say; it's what families hear. And families hear a lot of mixed messages about how to be successful in this process, and they very often hear what they want to hear. And they're hoping, I think, in many cases, that it's the family down the block that disarms. And they keep going
Right.
so that their
Less
child
competition, right.
receives the benefits. And that's where we need to say, no, look, really, it's truly okay for you to take a collectivist approach to this. You're all going to be okay.
Right. Would you say one of the life skills then that you might be looking for is follow through? So whatever it is you choose, regardless of the outcome, whether it's successful or not, you have devoted yourself over time and you followed through to the end. And if you go down with the ship, so be it. Right?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's the sense of like, follow through with the thing it is you do, and it's okay if you don't win a state championship.
Right.
Like that's
where sports are a great teacher.
Invite me onto your podcast.
You're invited.
First guest.
So yeah, that's right. Like, I don't care, we don't care. I don't care personally. I mean, I care about students being happy and successful, but like, that you got a bigger trophy than the kid down the block is not ultimately why we're going to make the decision we make. Mm-hmm. So do it for the enjoyment of the activity rather than for, the size of the trophy at the end.
Right. And then to Bryant's point, not just the joy of it or the enjoyment of it, but this full spectrum of emotions that come with anything to which you're devoted.
Right.
So sometimes it will be tedious.
Yes.
And other times you'll be excited about it, but.
And you'll be heartbroken.
Right.
And you'll be
heartbroken.
and
Exactly. And you'll lose and you'll win and
right.
you'll
Right.
But also just know heartbroken is okay, right? It's a natural.
Right.
Like again, we can't protect people from how they feel. And the last thing I want to ever do is have somebody suppress how they're feeling, because as we mentioned earlier, exposure is the best way of being able to get through this. But I think sometimes I keep going back to the book that's written by the folks who have done acceptance commitment therapy. There's this happiness trap, which I think we all buy into this idea that we live our lives in social media, we see everything is in a particular lens or way, and it sort of gets us to buy into this and thinking that this is real, when in essence it's not. And how do we sort of learn something different from that?
We're good?
I can't remember what this one was. I had 2 hand signals to learn. I forgot half of them. Okay. Does anyone else have another question? Last question. I think that might have been final question. Yes. That must be the signal.
Oh, I just wanted to ask you guys, since you were talking about follow through, what about experimentation?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Exploration.
How do you balance that?
I'll just say that, Angela Duckworth
Yep.
talked about sampling, and I think that's a really good point. I don't have these guys might have a more robust answer, but even as a parent, I will say you've got to, first of all, the act of like learning to try things isn't of itself a life skill, because you should be trying things for the rest of your life. And being comfortable with the fact that you may like it and you may not like it, and you have to try it in order to know and not be amazing at everything. So I think that one of the things that, again, we didn't get to go into as much depth, but was this tremendous pressure to specialize at a very young age. And when you specialize in something at a very young age, you often lose out on sampling and experimentation. So it's not just that you might specialize and you might end up with a sports injury and not get to stay with that thing, but you often don't get to try all kinds of things that they're sort of, ideally, maybe natural ages to even try them. Like, so you never knew that you were good at pottery, or that you didn't like it at all, or that you might fall in love with cooking. And one of the people that we interviewed, this woman who runs Melissa and Doug, a toy company, talked about how all the things she did in her childhood, and then she went off to, I forget where, an elite university, and went off to work at a, I think Bear Stearns, and she hated it. And she talks about finding what she loved, but the only reason she was able to find it is because she was able to draw on the joy in all the things that she did in experimenting as a child. So those are still, anyway, that's my view. It's very important, and I think that, you know, the emphasis on kids, parents who are like, my kid's on a baseball team and they're on a travel team and they play it all year round, so they couldn't possibly have time for this, that, and the other thing, absolutely are missing something.
Great. Thank you so much for coming. It was fun. Thanks for
And then
having me.
how are they going to get someone where, like here, and actually maybe take a class that they're less comfortable taking?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, people do that at Brown.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being here in mass. We're so happy so many of you could be here. And, it was really fun.
Yes.
And thank you guys to our panel
Yes,
for taking the
thank you so
time
much.
to be with us.
We had
you for
so
making
much
Thank you.
fun.
Yes,
It's
just-
great. It was a lot of
In
fun.
the green room.
That's right. And main stage. Thank you.